Joe Swinson.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Amos, and as always it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd like to congratulate the Right Honourable Member for South Suffolk for introducing the debate, and it's good to see many members of the committee here, and indeed input to the debate from members who are not on the committee. I always think it's useful when at these Westminster Hall debates of Select Committee reports they have a wider airing than just those that have already sat through all of the evidence sessions. It's a very timely debate, and I think perhaps fortuitously, not necessarily by design, the committee's inquiry was at a very important time in terms of the issue of biofuels. During the months that we took our evidence and then published the report in January, there was a huge amount of public and scientific debate, and indeed increasingly more and more organisations came out and came to some of the same conclusions that the committee has come to, whether it was the Royal Society or the UN or the OECD or the government's own chief scientists. More and more people and organisations were questioning the wisdom of our relentless pursuit of biofuels at the moment. I'd also just like to say, Mr Amos, that the Environmental Audit Select Committee, which I joined last July, is the first time I've served on a Select Committee of the House, and indeed this was one of the first full inquiries that I sat through. And I have to say, I found and do find the experience of being a Select Committee incredibly refreshing as a member of this House, having had 2 years without that experience, particularly because in politics the way that things generally work is that we take a position and then we justify it. Whereas with the Select Committee, I have very much enjoyed taking an issue that you're interested in, listening to all the evidence, and then taking a position as a result of that. And I think that if there were more, perhaps more debates like this and more publicity of the work of Select Committees, that the reputation of this House might be somewhat elevated in the minds of the general public. And before this inquiry, as somebody who's interested in the environment and very keen to tackle the problem of climate change, my general view on biofuels, not necessarily particularly informed beyond reading the newspapers, was a sort of vaguely generally positive view that this seemed like quite a good idea. We've got major problems with pollution from road transport. There don't seem to be very many easy ways to wean ourselves off our love addiction with the car as a means of getting around, and so this would seem to be a sensible way to solve part of that problem and put it right. And indeed, it reminded me of my only other sort of experience of biofuels was about 7 years ago when I was living in Yorkshire, and a friend I knew was involved in a company which was actually producing biofuels from used and waste cooking oils, and at that time was lobbying for the government to introduce a lower fuel duty on biofuels to make them a viable prospect. And I seemed to think that was all a very good idea, and I was delighted when the government indeed made that tax change and enabled companies like that one to prosper and to sell their product to the market. So that was my initial view going into the inquiry. But I have to say I was quite surprised when listening to the evidence, at what my ultimate conclusions were on the issue of biofuels. I think on a superficial level we can all agree that the idea is a sound one. And indeed, there are many biofuels, as we learned in the inquiry, which are, in always good for the environment, and the used cooking oil is one such scenario, rather than it being a waste product and sent to landfill or polluting our waterways. It actually gets reused, and you don't have any of the negative effects of land use change or anything else. Definitely the type of product we should be supporting. Similarly, some of the Brazilian sugarcane actually seems to tick all of the boxes in terms of sustainability and efficiency of the product as well. And indeed, the evidence we heard was to some degree mixed, but there does seem to be some cause for optimism when looking at second or third generation biofuels and the future possibilities that there might be to harvest more of the plant and therefore get a much better carbon reduction for the same amount of crops grown. So I think there's definitely some merit in the biofuels arena, but the damaging effects have been very well documented and indeed highlighted in today's debate. The fact that it's not always certain that there will actually be overall carbon reductions, carbon emission reductions, due to the amount of fertilisers and oil-based products that go into producing the biofuel crops in the first place. The impact on food production and availability around the world, which, as we've heard, certainly does have other causes as well. But I do not dismiss lightly the UN expert on this issue, and I think we would be unwise to do so. And also, from a general sort of common sense point of view, if a farmer is going to get more money from growing biofuel crops than from growing food, then and that land use change is going to happen, then it's logical that that will have an impact on food supply in other countries, and particularly in some developing countries where there are general food shortages and great problems. And indeed, the other related issue which really struck me was the one of deforestation and land being cleared in order to create the land to grow the biofuels on. And of course, we know that deforestation is one of the biggest causes of carbon emissions. About a fifth of the world's carbon emissions each year coming from deforestation. So hardly a very smart thing to do to be clearing forests to grow biofuels to reduce by some amount the carbon emitted through road transport. So, with all of these issues about biofuels, it would seem to be sensible and clear that what we need is to have very robust sustainability standards and emissions reduction standards, so that customers can be certain that when they're buying fuel which has got an element of biofuel in it, that they know that it is actually reducing the overall emissions from their vehicle, and indeed that they know that it has been produced in a sustainable manner. Which is why, as the report outlines, there's a great concern that we've gone ahead with the target this year before all of those standards are in place and up and running. So I really think that is one mistake in terms of this rush that we've had. I think the other thing which was very worrying was in the evidence sessions actually trying to work out if it is possible to create robust enough sustainability standards. Where it might be possible, and certainly it's more likely for UK production, where we have more control over the regulation and the accountability. For sustainability standards for biofuels produced in other countries around the world, how those standards can actually capture the prospect, not necessarily of deforestation to grow biofuels, but changing the land use for food crops to biofuels, and then deforestation in order to grow food crops. The causality and the linkage may not be very clear, may in fact be impossible to capture within sustainability standards, and as we know, that's actually hugely likely to increase the overall emissions. And so until we manage to deal with the thorny issues like that in terms of sustainability standards, it's very difficult to see how we can be confident to go ahead and think that we will definitely be reducing emissions as a result. The value for money issue has also rightly been raised here today. The member for Ruislip Northwood talked about it in his contribution. And indeed, the amounts of money we're talking about are very significant. From the RTFO alone, there's £500 million of lost revenue to the government. And I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is that the best use of £500 million to reduce emissions and to tackle climate change? If we think about some of the sums being spent on other initiatives, if we look at the results that can be achieved from promoting better environmentally friendly driving, from promoting energy efficiency, which always seems to be the Cinderella of the climate change argument, because everybody agrees that it's the best way to tackle climate change and probably the cheapest way to tackle climate change, but the money and resources allocated to it often seem to be bottom of the pile. Indeed, one of the other ways which was suggested in our evidence that we could better tackle carbon emissions with money like that would be actually to have avoided deforestation schemes, or indeed reforestation schemes, to set up more carbon sinks. So I think the value for money question is very much left unanswered. Now, I do understand from the Department of Transport's point of view why biofuels seems like such an attractive solution, and the elegance of it in a sense that, we can say to people that you can keep driving, continue with the same behaviours, but that's fine because we'll reduce the emissions nonetheless. And there is an argument, and there is a place within policy making for ensuring that people can continue with some of the same behaviours but reduce the carbon impact of doing so. And indeed some of the work that's happening within Europe, in which the government's been promoting on cleaner vehicle standards, is one very good example of that. And obviously that is a sort of pain-free way to reduce emissions. But it's not a silver bullet, and we do also have to grasp the nettle of behaviour change. And indeed, I think some of the resources that we could be putting towards that might well be better spent. The Honourable Lady for Stockton South talked about the priority for tackling climate change, and this, the committee, its inquiries focus on little else. And all the members of the committee I know are very committed to tackling climate change. I think what we were trying to express in our report was just the idea that this may not actually be the best way to do it, and that there's very many other alternatives for the same resource that we could pursue instead, and which would be more cost effective. So, given all of these problems, the current targets, I think, are at the moment counterproductive in pushing and rushing towards biofuels. It's not to say biofuels can't play an important role, it's just to say that we need to take stock and halt our rush towards this somewhat until we're able to iron out some of these problems. And the government, to its credit, and it's not very often I say that, but the government, to its credit, did announce in February that it would be reviewing biofuels, and that is very welcome. The government is often criticised for U-turns, but I think that it's not a sign of weakness when the facts change to change your mind. And the situation that we've been in over the past few months certainly has been changing rapidly on this issue. There have been many more reports and documents, much more information which has been brought forward highlighting these concerns. It's not actually just an issue for the government, as has been mentioned. It's an EU issue, because we're tied into these targets through the European Union. And indeed the EU, I think in many ways, has been taking the lead on climate change in a global way. And I'm sure when these targets were put in place, it was done for the right reasons and it was very well-meaning. But the science has moved on somewhat. We have a different understanding now of biofuels, and I think it is time for us to make sure these targets are revised down until we address these sustainability concerns. And I would hope that the government would use its voice in Europe to be discussing with our European partners how we can actually progress this issue at a European level, to just stop the rush and take stock and make sure that we have those sustainability standards in place and address these issues before we go headlong into promoting this. I know the Minister does have a genuine desire to reduce transport emissions, and I think the importance of this issue is symbolised on both sides in the toing and froing of reports between the government and the committee, trying to see whether we can actually come to some common position. The government has started to move somewhat on this issue, and I would just encourage them to move further and recognise we do need to stop this rush until the serious and real concerns about sustainability have been addressed.
Mr.